Did you see the front of the Sunday Express this week?
No, go on.
Boris wants to fix unfair Brexit deal.
Yes, but it is the European Union is making the point, James, that it's the same deal that they just want Boris Johnson agreed.
No, I know.
Yes.
That's why it's so funny.
Oh.
Isn't it? Because he negotiated it and signed it and campaigned entirely off the back of it at the last general election, and now he wants to fix it.
Yes, but he can't fix it without it becoming
redundant. He's already signed it.
Yes.
But it was supposed to be oven-ready and brilliant.
Yes, that was the point Rachel Reeves was making, that it isn't oven-ready.
What a time
and it doesn't go properly.
So you think that... And I was preparing to... in fact, to be honest, I think when Theresa May left office, all predictions were sent back to the drawing board. But my earliest prediction of all, that I couldn't see this ending with no deal or no Brexit, was how it was eventually going to shake down. I think that's back on the table, isn't it? No deal now greater than 50% chance, or would you be reluctant to put your name to a number?
What's interesting is we're going to get the answer if the government holds firm on its pledge to not to extend the transition period, and bear in mind that they have legislated within the withdrawal agreement, and it would require the government to go back to the House of Commons to overturn that aspect of the withdrawal agreement, not to extend the transition period beyond December the 31st. Yeah. And that is politically tricky for the government that at the moment, unless they are prepared, and given that the European Union appears to be holding firm, somebody is going to have to give way on those three areas if the European Union isn't prepared to do it. And of course, David Davis, the former Brexit Secretary, has said that this is an opportunity with the COVID-19 pandemic to take advantage of from the UK's point of view, that if they're not prepared to back down and we're not prepared and the UK isn't prepared to back down, then we revert to what was previously known as a no-deal Brexit and now is known as what was that Australian-style arrangement?
No, it's not. It's known, it's known as a no-deal Brexit. Speaking of David Davis, any sign of the German car industry? Because it's getting quite tight now.
It's the 11th hour. Yes, I know that one.
They're not coming? Because they're not supposed to put up with any of this, remember?
They're not. I haven't heard from the German car industry recently.
Okay. Theo Washwood, as ever, providing a neat analysis of all that is unfolding. And I don't know, actually. I've got pretty much everything right on this, sometimes through luck, sometimes through judgment since day one. But I don't know. I don't think... It doesn't matter what people like me do or Keir Starmer do with regard to the transition. It would arguably be foolish for him to call for it, because it won't make the blindest bit of difference to anything. Not everybody agrees with that position, but I do for what it's worth. But really, the only people that should be explaining the necessity and wisdom of a transition are the same people that were trying to sell you Brexit 4 years ago, and still are. Some of them have at least found a scintilla of conscience. Some of them have come out and said, of course we need a transition. But I think the only voices that matter in this ludicrous bear pit that we've now created in our country, the only voices that matter when it comes to applying pressure to the Prime Minister to do the only sensible thing in the context of coronavirus and extend the negotiations, not even for, just until they're finished within a 2-year window. The only voices that matter are the voices that would be loosely described as pro-Brexit. That's just my perspective on this. But I still, I told you they'd need custom posts in Ireland. I told you that chlorinated chicken would be... because nothing else makes sense. There's nothing else you can point at and say in concrete terms, that's what will happen. When you put that penny in that slot, this is what happens. Which is why so much of the debate descended into meaningless talks about fish, blue passports, and somehow believing in things being a way of making them come true.
So Boris Johnson ran his entire election campaign on a single slogan of "Get Brexit Done." Now, secondary to that, there was the oven-ready Brexit deal. And I had been talking at the time about how this wasn't a deal. A deal is something that you will have in place that will last for years, for decades. Instead, he was calling the withdrawal agreement a deal. This is our Brexit deal. When in reality it was the withdrawal agreement, which only dealt with leaving the European Union. What came after was to be negotiated between the EU and the UK. It was not a deal. There was no oven-ready deal. There was no Brexit deal in place. That was the withdrawal agreement. Now, what's ironic is that Boris Johnson signed off on that agreement. He said, it's fine, I got my changes made, the European Union agreed to it, they signed it, Boris Johnson signed it, and that was it, done and dusted. Now what we're hearing is that Boris Johnson wants to re-enter and change certain aspects of the withdrawal agreement. Unilaterally. It's the equivalent of signing up to a contract for a service, not actually reading that contract, and then 6 months later complaining that there's something in the contract that you don't like. Now, this is a problem, but it could have been resolved by simply extending the transition period. But what did Boris Johnson do instead? He put legislation through the House of Commons, barring him from actually asking for an extension. So he didn't read a contract, or his team didn't read a contract, signed it, then realized that there's problems for them in that contract, and then instead of just asking for an extension to the transition period, which would help them iron out those issues, no, instead he says, let's make it illegal for the government to actually ask for an extension. This is incompetence on an epic scale. This is not just Boris Johnson messing up and making a fool of himself. This is Boris Johnson destroying the United Kingdom because of the potential impact it's going to have on Northern Ireland. So where does this leave Boris Johnson? Well, he could go down two separate routes. He could go back to Parliament, overturn the legislation that he asked Parliament to implement, therefore unloosening the shackles that he has imposed upon himself to allow his government to ask for an extension. Of course, the alternative is to leave the transition period on the 31st of December this year without a deal. So let's look at the first scenario. Boris Johnson goes back to Parliament. He asks Parliament to undo the legislation. His government is now able to ask for a transition period extension. They go to the European Union, ask for a transition period extension. The European Union probably, most likely, will say, yes, you can. And it's extended for another 2 years, or at least a year. Now, this would be, of course, damaging for Boris Johnson because the Brexiteers would lose their minds and they would see it as a betrayal. Boris Johnson's position would become untenable and he would be probably removed as Prime Minister in a similar way to Theresa May's exit from the Tory party leadership. So, of course, the UK would no longer be a member of the European Union as it is today, but it would continue to follow the rules and regulations that appear in the withdrawal agreement that Boris Johnson and his government, remember, signed up to. The can would be kicked down the road for another year or two. Brexiteers would be very unhappy, and the situation would remain as it is. Brexit would disappear off the radar politically for another while, and we'd start talking about something else. Meanwhile, negotiations between the UK and EU would continue behind closed doors. So what would happen if the UK left the transition period without a deal? Now, this is something that Brexiteers are extremely quiet about, what will happen. Some will say that the UK would resort to WTO rules, which is quite ironic because one of the mantras of Brexit was taking back control from unelected bodies. If the UK follows WTO rules, then you would be giving control over to the WTO. Now, trade is only one aspect of the relationship between the UK and the EU after Brexit. However, the WTO only covers one issue, and that's trade of goods. They don't cover goods and services. However, there is a whole range of other issues that the UK and EU need to negotiate on, such as security, science, education, tourism, just to name a few, which means that the UK and EU, after a so-called no-deal Brexit, will actually sit down and work out a number of different deals, which renders the whole idea of a no-deal Brexit a completely empty slogan, just like the other empty slogans that the Tories and Boris Johnson have been pumping into the heads of the public since the very beginning of this entire Brexit saga. Let me know in the comments, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks. Why not become a Patreon and enjoy access to our Discord server where we share news, chat, and have some fun? If you become a patron, you can also make video suggestions on topics that are important to you. Check it out via the link in the description.